The type of partial panel flying you're likely to practice the most is what results from a vacuum failure. Without backup instruments in IMC, this is a serious situation. The most critical phase of a vacuum system failure is the beginning. As the gyros spin down, the vacuum instruments gradually become inaccurate and unreliable. The attitude indicator slowly falls off its axis, indicating a gradual pitch and bank, while the heading indicator becomes sluggish and unresponsive. It's very tempting to continue to fly with the failed instruments and not recognize the failure until it's too late. Since early recognition is critical, you need to know what the first indications are of a vacuum failure in your airplane. Naturally, the vacuum gauge is one of those indicators, but if it's not in your habit to scan it regularly, it's easy to miss. Making it part of the regular flow pattern helps, but if the vacuum gauge is your only indication of a failure, you'll want to incorporate it into your instrument scan. The 172 we're flying has two other indicators of low vacuum, an off flag on the attitude indicator and a low vacuum annunciator light. Our full panel instrument scan centers around the attitude indicator, which may seem to be a problem given the possibility of a failure, but we have a few things going for us. First, our full panel scan method has encouraged an intuition for what performance to expect from a given attitude, power, and configuration. That works in reverse too. If we know what performance we're getting at a given power setting, we can infer what the attitude must be. Any discrepancy should raise red flags and make us suspect a failure. Early recognition, again, is critical. That mental picture of the attitude indicator that we've inferred from our performance instruments serves as a substitute for the actual attitude indicator. By this point, we've developed a feel for the control pressures required to change the attitude by a certain amount. As a result, the basic principle behind the scan is roughly the same. We're evaluating performance, inferring the attitude from that, and then making control inputs to change the attitude by a desired amount if necessary. Before starting partial panel training, it's essential to have a well-developed feel for the effects of attitude, power, and configuration on performance, as well as for the control pressures involved in changing attitudes and transitioning between profiles. Without that background, partial panel practice can actually encourage bad habits that carry over into the full panel scan, such as chasing performance instrument indications. Develop a fundamentally sound full panel instrument scan first, and you'll have an easier time with the transition to partial panel. Let's join the flight on the runway, where we'll take off, experience some instrument failures, and discuss the partial panel scan techniques. Okay, so we're going to rotate here and pitch to our normal climb attitude. That's about 10 degrees, and we know that should get us 74 knots and about 1,000 feet per minute. And right off the bat here, we can see that something isn't correct because we've got 60 knots indicated on the airspeed. We're getting roughly the vertical speed I'd expect. We're at a slightly higher density altitude than where we recorded the numbers, but pretty close to 1,000. Altitude is increasing, so the only thing that disagrees in this picture is the airspeed. The configuration's correct, the flaps are up, so I think there's probably a problem with the airspeed indicator here. Another place I can validate that suspicion is the GPS, which is showing an 80 knot ground speed. Now that's ground speed and not indicated airspeed, so they're not going to agree, but that's much closer to what I would expect if I were climbing at about 74 knots indicated rather than 60. I know I don't have a 20 knot tailwind here. So we diagnose the problem by knowing the numbers. We pitch to an appropriate attitude for the given power setting, and we're not getting the performance that we expect. And that made us suspicious of either a wrong setup, which we verified we did set up correctly, or a problem with the airspeed indicator. And from this point on, we'll just continue to fly our predetermined profiles and trust that the airspeed that results from those is going to be what we recorded. And it's not too big of a deal. The key is in recognition, and then after that we can fly our numbers. So here's the common error here. We've taken off and we're pitching for the climb, but we see that the airspeed isn't increasing. It's only at 60 knots. And so without returning to the attitude indicator, we just start pushing on the controls, watching the airspeed to see it increase. And before we know it, we're pitched steeply back down. We exit the clouds, And we've got the ground coming up at us. Alright, so we're in cruise flight here, and we've just had a vacuum failure, and I have 3 main indications that we've had this failure. Number one, that's probably the most obvious, is the off flag on the attitude indicator. It's the center of my scan, so I see it right away. Right above that, and just about equally as obvious, is the vacuum enunciation on the enunciator panel. And then finally on our engine instrument cluster, we can see the vacuum gauge has gone all the way to the peg at the bottom. And that's the one that I'm least likely to pick up on. And if I'm flying a plane that doesn't have the other indicators, if that's the only thing, I may start to see the effects of the failure before I actually see one of those indicators of it. And we can see here what's happening is the attitude indicator is slowly starting to go off of its axis. We're starting to get a slow pitch up and a bank to the left. The heading indicator will be getting sluggish here. It'll be slowing down and eventually stopping. And it's really tempting at this stage to try to fly with the attitude indicator anyway. We've done that for so long that your instinct here will be to try to level the wings. But we know it's wrong here, and so we have to resist the urge to do that. Probably the easiest way to resist that urge is to cover it up. So I'd recommend having something nearby that you can use to cover it, whether it's actual instrument covers or a piece of paper, or even just covering it with your hand until you do have a grip on the situation. And you don't want it to be something that's in your flight bag. You don't want to have to reach into the back seat and recover something from the flight bag. Alright, so I've got the airplane trimmed out for cruise when the failure happens, so I don't need to do much. I certainly don't need to make big control inputs to chase anything. If I keep the wings level on the turn coordinator, we're not going to turn. And the turn coordinator shows initially the rate of roll as you're rolling into and out of turns. So it's going to be real sensitive to showing changes in my bank angle as they happen. So if I keep the wings level, I'm not going to turn. Similarly, the vertical speed, although it lags, it'll show the beginnings of a change in trend immediately. So as I start to deviate from level flight here, that needle is going to show an indication of a climb or a descent right away. Now it's not going to stabilize on the actual trend until some number of seconds later, but it's going to be a good indication that something is changing. Alright, so my first priority was just keeping the airplane under control, keeping the wings level, and in the process we've drifted a little bit off our heading. Now I've got the GPS track and desired track, so that's really going to be my primary for heading in these cases. So I'm tracking 134, desired track is 127. It's not heading, but it's more useful than heading, and certainly more useful than using the compass. So if I want to make myself get back to an appropriate desired track, we're tracking about 6 degrees right of course here. I'm not going to look at the GPS while I do it because that's so far away from my other instruments. I'm going to return to my turn coordinator and roll into just a shallow bank to the left, maybe a half standard rate, and I'm going to count off a few seconds in my head. So 1, 2, 3, and then level. That shallow bank ensures that my pitch doesn't change much, makes things happen slowly. Now I look over at the GPS and I see that our track is to the left of our desired track, and this is going to bring us back on course. So if I just keep the wings level here, we'll make our way back on course. If I want a greater intercept angle, I can just do the same thing, roll into a half standard rate turn, count off a couple seconds, roll the wings level, and see where I'm at. Now when the needle returns to the center, I just kind of undo the turn that I just made. A little bit less of a turn because we were pointed right of course initially. But I might roll into half standard rate to the right, count off something like 2 seconds, and then see where that puts us. So here we go, we'll go half standard rate to the right. Just count out 1001, 1002, and level. And we're pretty much right on target here. 126 for a track, 127 desired track. Now they're lined up perfectly, and if I keep the wings level, we'll maintain that heading and stay on course. So now we're a little bit off on our altitude here, and we need to make a correction. And generally speaking, in full panel, if we're less than 100 feet off, I'm just going to adjust pitch by half a degree or a degree or so. Partial panel, it's a little bit tougher to do that because we don't have an attitude indicator. We can't be quite as precise as we could be with it. So I'm a little more likely to just use power when I'm in a partial panel situation, making a correction. So what I'm going to do here is bring the throttle back just until I hear a change. So I just heard a change in the RPM. All the while just keeping the wings level on the turn coordinator. We should see a small descent start to develop. Not really using any forward or aft pressure on the yoke, just letting it happen here. And when we get back to our target altitude, I just undo the change. So I add throttle until I hear the RPM increase again by that little bit. And we're back in level flight. So for those corrections in altitude, often it's easiest partial panel to just make a small power change to make that happen. Alright, now let's practice making some turns to headings. I'm going to take the GPS and put it on a page that's not useful for us here. And we're going to do this the old school way, just using timed turns to get to headings. Now, in your airplane, if you've got a GPS and your heading indicator fails, you're going to use the GPS track. And you might even ask ATC for something like no gyro vectors, where they tell you to start the turn and stop the turn. You're probably not going to be turning to headings with the compass. But it's still a good thing to practice because it's a good exercise in developing that mental map of your current situation and controlling the airplane precisely while keeping a grasp on the situation around you. Alright, so let's try a turn to a heading here. So we're on a 120 heading, and we'll make a turn to a 360 heading. Now we know a standard rate turn is 3 degrees per second, so we can do the math and figure out how long this turn should be. But the easiest way to visualize this is to use a free OBS card. So for example, our nav2 we're not using. I'm going to twist my current heading in here on the OBS, 120 about. Now I can see at a glance on there that north would be a left turn. And I know that halfway around would be 30 seconds, all the way around would be 60 seconds. And north is about a third of the way between halfway and all the way around. So I'm going to make a left turn for 40 seconds here. And that should put us pretty close to north. So let's get our timer ready. Slowly roll into a standard rate turn and start the timer. Slowly is important because the turn coordinator will tend to overshoot as it indicates rate of roll initially. Now I'm using the amount of back pressure that I remember from experience, and I'm calibrating that using the altimeter and the vertical speed. The altimeter will show my current trend if I can see it moving one way or the other. The vertical speed, though, will be really quick to show a change in trend. It just won't establish itself on the actual trend right away. And we're coming up on 40 seconds now. So we'll roll the wings level on the turn coordinator, release the back pressure that we were holding, and see where our compass stabilizes. It does tend to lag on turns to the north, so you can see it catching up, and we're right on target with our north heading. Now let's say we were a little bit off here, so now we're at about 345 or so on the compass. If we're going to use the compass to fix our heading, we need to make sure that we remember that this type of compass indicates turns in the opposite direction. So the headings that are to the right on the compass are actually to the left of us. So we want to get back to north in this case. What I'm going to do is roll into a half standard rate turn, just like we were doing with the GPS, and count off 3 or 4 seconds here. I don't care about doing the math and figuring out the exact number of seconds. I just want to get a turn going back towards my heading and then see where that puts us. We can fine-tune from there. So we'll roll into the left turn, 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004. Roll the wings level. Let's see where we are. Wait for the compass to catch up. And that looks pretty good. We can fine-tune it with the similar technique if we need to. Alright, let's say now we want to go direct to a VOR. And we're going to use the actual VOR here rather than the GPS. So what I'm going to do, I'll get the frequency from the GPS. We're on the nearest group here. I'll go to nearest VORs. And we're going to go direct to the 29 Palms VOR, TNP. So let's do that. Here's the frequency. We can load it just by moving the cursor onto it and pressing enter. And then swap it into the active. We'll put the CDI into VLOC mode. And of course, identify. Alright, with all that done, let's center the OBS with the 2 indication. I know it's centered here with the from, so I'm just going to flip it around in the other direction. Alright, so now we want to go to 300. This ends up being just the same exercise we just did in turns to headings. In order to visualize this, I can twist my OBS to our current heading of 360 on the nav2 because I'm not using it. And a 300 heading looks like about a 20-second turn to the left. So here we go. Now by the time I get there, the needle will be a little bit off to the left. So if I want to turn a few seconds past 20, that'll work out pretty nice and give me an intercept angle. So there's 20, 21, 22, 23. Let's roll level and see where we are. Wait for the compass to catch up. And it looks like we might have undershot just slightly, not very much though. We're pretty much right on 300. So now, if I want to put in an intercept to the left, I can think of this in terms of the timing of the turns rather than the actual heading if I want to. So if I want to put in, say, a 2-second turn worth of intercept to the left, we'll do that half standard rate or so, 1001, 1002, and then roll level. And then we'll see how the VOR indicator reacts if the CDI starts coming back towards the center. And it looks like our heading now is 295 or so, so it should bring it back. If I want it to come back a little bit quicker, let's go 2 seconds again to the left on half standard rate. Now we've got about a 10 or a 15 degree intercept. And if you're looking at the compass and you're having a hard time visualizing whether that heading would be an appropriate intercept heading or not, just take a look at your OBS indicator on the nav1 now, and all of your intercept headings to the left will be to the left of the OBS selection in the direction the needle's deflected. So let's take a look at a few of our recorded flight parameters and see how the scan works for the transition between them. The hardest thing that you're going to do partial panel is usually airspeed changes as far as basic attitude flying is concerned. And that's because the control pressures are constantly changing and you don't have the attitude indicator to be as precise with the pitch changes or maintaining pitch. So what we're going to do is slow down to our 90 knot approach level speed here. We'll use the turn coordinator to keep the wings level, and we'll be inferring what our attitude is as we slow down based on the performance that we're getting. Now our vertical speed is going to be helpful here because it'll show deviations from level flight right away. Alright, so we're going to bring the throttle back to 2100 RPM, and immediately the nose is going to try to drop on us, and so we're going to increase back pressure to keep the vertical speed needle on 0. Remember, the altimeter is the best bet for showing us our current trend, but the vertical speed indicator is going to tell us whether we're deviating from it right away. Now I'm increasing the trim as well, or I'm adding aft trim to eliminate the control pressures it takes to keep it here. There we are at 90 knots. I'm going to bump the RPM up just a touch. We are all the way up at 7,000 feet, so it's probably going to take more. And that's the sort of thing with learning our numbers that you'll get used to anticipating those differences. In fact, now it's taking 2,200 RPM or so to hold 90 knots up at 7,000 feet. But anytime the airspeed is changing, the control pressures are going to be changing, and that's when your job is going to be most difficult when you're flying partial panel. So you want to plan those airspeed changes around less busy times in the flight, when you have more bandwidth to devote to flying the airplane. Alright, let's start a 500 foot per minute descent straight ahead then. We know that's going to take a 300 RPM reduction. So we'll bring that back, and it's going to take a 3-degree pitch change. And that should happen pretty much on its own. And we know it'll overshoot initially, so if I put just a little bit of back pressure in to stop the descent at 500 feet per minute, it should stay right here. Now I don't have an attitude indicator, but I still have a mental picture of where the attitude is. I know that I've got a 500 foot per minute descent here at about 1900 RPM in a clean configuration and 90 knots. So I know that I'm about probably 2 degrees nose down. So I'm still using that mental picture and making adjustments to adjust that mental picture. I'm inferring the attitude indicator from the other instruments. Alright, now let's look at a missed approach. Now this is going to involve a pretty significant pitch change, which is difficult when you don't have the attitude indicator. But we figured out that if we go full throttle, the attitude that the airplane wants to pitch to is about 8 degrees, and we get 85 knots out of that. We also know that it's going to initially overshoot that. It's going to pitch beyond 8 degrees to something slower than 85 knots, oscillate back and forth a little bit until it settles on 85. So it's actually going to involve a little bit of forward pressure to keep it from overshooting, and then it should stay right there. And what we should expect is at sea level about 800 feet per minute, probably less than that here. So here we go, full throttle. The full throttle comes with right rudder, of course. Now here comes the pitch up, and just a touch of forward pressure. Now we've probably overshot a little bit here because we're doing better than 1,000 feet per minute, but I want to keep it simple here. I don't want to overreact. It's easy to get exactly out of phase with these pitch changes and start doing big oscillations up and down. But right about here, I'm estimating that I'm at about 8 degrees nose up, because I'm getting 85 knots, slightly faster. I'm getting 500 feet per minute, which is reasonable given our altitude. And we're stabilized right here. Now, it might be slightly less than 8 degrees nose up, because at the higher altitude that might be where is appropriate here. Now when we get to 7,000, let's level off to cruise flight. So I'm visualizing the attitude indicator at 7 or 8 degrees nose up, and the amount of forward pressure that it takes to bring that to the horizon. I'm verifying that that's working based on the indications I'm getting from the altimeter, from the vertical speed, from the airspeed. The airspeed should be increasing, of course. So we lead that level off by about 50 feet. And now I'm using whatever forward pressure it takes to keep the altitude from changing. And I'm getting a heads up on changes that are about to happen from the vertical speed needle. I'm trimming off the forward pressure. As we accelerate. And keeping the wings level on the turn coordinator. Now we're at our cruise speed. The power could come back just a touch. If we wanted to at 7,000 feet, we could leave the throttle wide open. And we're back in cruise flight here. Attitude plus power plus configuration equals performance. When one element is missing, you can infer it from the others, but only if you have a solid understanding of the performance profiles for your aircraft. Then, regular practice of partial panel situations keeps those skills sharp.